Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. This is Unit 1, Part 3 of the AP European History curriculum. And in this unit, we are going to see how the relationship between the colonies and the British Crown evolved from one of cooperation and royal charter grants into one of increasing tension, conflict, and eventually revolution. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, before we get started, if you need to review Unit 1, Part 1 or 2, you can click right here in the cards and go to those videos. Also, if this video helps you out, then subscribe so you can be notified when I post new videos. Alright, now let's get to it. So to get us off on the right foot, let's define our terms. First of all, when Europeans talk about the crown, they don't mean some fancy hat that the monarch wears. They mean the monarchy itself as an institution. And so when we talk about the relationship between the colonies and the crown, we are talking about the relationship between the colonies and the English monarchy. Secondly, during the 17th and 18th centuries, British America consisted of three primary types of colonies regarding governance and their connections to the crown: royal colonies, proprietary colonies, and charter or self-governing colonies. Royal colonies were exactly what they sounded like. They were colonies owned and fully administered by the crown, so the king would appoint governors and councils to run those colonies. The purpose of royal colonies was primarily to generate wealth for the mother country and maintain British influence in North America. Examples of royal colonies were Virginia after 1624, New York, and Massachusetts after 1691. Proprietary colonies were granted to individuals or groups by the crown. The proprietors then ruled these colonies with considerable autonomy, appointing governors and establishing local laws, which had to be approved by the king, of course. Maryland and Pennsylvania were two of the most prominent proprietary colonies. And finally, charter colonies were those granted charters to self-govern. They were run by either elected assemblies or corporations, and this model emphasized local autonomy. Early Virginia, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Rhode Island were charter colonies. Now, despite these classifications, the crown still held ultimate authority. Governors represented the king in the colonies, and royal directives could impact colonial affairs regardless of the type of colony. In fact, over time, many charter and proprietary colonies became royal colonies as London tightened imperial control. Okay, now let us talk about the role that governors played in the relationship between the colonies and the crown. Governors, whether appointed by the crown or proprietors, were the chief executives of their respective colonies, and they had to walk a real tightrope in terms of their relationship to the crown and the colonies. On the one hand, they were expected to carry out the will of the crown, but on the other hand, they had to work within the constraints of colonial politics and popular opinion. Let me explain. Governors were appointed by the crown and they served at the pleasure of the crown. In other words, the governor could do whatever the crown asked him to do, and he could be removed at any time. Furthermore, as we saw in the last video, the British monarchy viewed itself as having an obligation to promote Anglicanism in the colonies, and so it was the governor's job to make sure that happened. In addition, governors often faced opposition from colonial assemblies, which were elected by the people and thus more accountable to them than the crown. The assemblies controlled the purse strings of the colony, meaning that they could approve or disapprove the budget of the colony. And guess who had to enforce the laws passed by the colonial legislature? That's right, it was the governor. And if the governor didn't get paid, well, he might not be able to keep up his lavish lifestyle. Finally, the governor also had to deal with the reality of colonial militias, armed and often led by men who had been elected by the people. And so, as you can imagine, if there was a conflict between royal authority and the wishes of the people, the governor was unlikely to have the support of the militia. Suffice it to say, being a governor was a thankless job. Okay, now let's talk about colonial assemblies. We'll start with the basics. The vast majority of colonial governors were appointed by the crown, but colonial assemblies were elected by property-owning male colonists. And because they were elected, they were far more responsive to colonial interests than governors were. For example, colonial assemblies developed traditions of self-government. In many colonies, they had full legislative power, meaning that they could levy taxes, create a budget, and make laws for the colony. And guess what? Oftentimes, they did this without even asking the crown first. And once they made a law, it was the governor's job to enforce it. And even though the crown didn't like it, the reality was that the elected assemblies were extremely popular with the colonists, and that popularity stemmed from the fact that assemblies stood for things like local autonomy and self-representation. And because of this, colonial assemblies would sometimes defy the crown. For example, in 1767, when Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, which placed new taxes on items like glass and tea, colonial assemblies argued back, saying that the taxes were a violation of their rights as Englishmen, and so to get back at the crown, colonial assemblies refused to fund royal officials, forcing some of them to resign in protest. Now, during this period, relations between Britain and the colonies were complicated, to say the least. And so in a minute we're going to talk about why that was the case. But before we do, let me remind you that if you want me to keep making these videos, then subscribe and leave me a comment telling me what you think I should cover in future videos. Also, if you want to give me some extra incentive to keep making these videos, then consider supporting me through various platforms. Links to both are in the description below. Okay, now let's finish this thing up. So to understand the rising tensions between the crown and the colonies, let's focus on one word: money. Remember, Britain came to view its North American colonies primarily as a means of economic benefit. And so, beginning in the 1660s, London began passing laws that made it more difficult for the colonies to trade with anyone except Britain. These laws were called the Navigation Acts, and they stipulated that certain goods, like tobacco, could only be shipped on British ships. In addition, British officials enforced a complicated system of tariffs and taxes on colonial trade, and these measures ensured that the colonies would always export their raw materials to Britain and buy manufactured goods from Britain, thereby making Britain rich and keeping colonial manufacturing weak. Now, to be fair, most of the time the Crown did not strictly enforce these laws. There was a period known as salutary neglect in which colonial trade was relatively free. And this was good news for colonial merchants who wanted to do business with whomever they wanted, but bad news for the mother country whose coffers could have been filled to the brim with gold. Now, the Crown did attempt to collect revenue from the colonies in other ways. For example, in 1732, they attempted to tax land based on the English system of land tenure, which required wealthy landowners to pay more in taxes than poor landowners, and that went over about as well as you might expect. Then in 1763, after Britain emerged victorious from the French and Indian War, Britain found itself deeply in debt, and so Parliament decided that it was finally time to tighten imperial control over the colonies and use them to help pay for that war. And so it passed the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, which placed heavy taxes on sugar and other goods imported to the colonies. And unsurprisingly, this did not go over well with the colonists. To them, these taxes were a violation of their rights as Englishmen. After all, they had no voice in Parliament, so they couldn't be taxed by Parliament, and so they began to push back. The boycott of British goods, petitions to the Crown, and even violent protests like the Boston Tea Party demonstrated colonial opposition to what they viewed as imperial overreach. And it was clear that the Crown's attempts to extract greater revenue from the colonies was undermining the very authority of the Crown. I mean, how does the Crown expect the people to support the monarchy when the monarchy is taxing them without representation? In response to the mounting tensions, British officials attempted to restore order with acts like the Quartering Act and the Coercive Acts, but these acts only alienated the colonies further, and by the end of the 1760s, the die had been cast. The relationship between the colonies and the Crown had irrevocably broken down. The resulting American Revolution was nothing less than a full-blown constitutional crisis, one that would result in the overthrow of a monarchy and the creation of a new kind of government in the United States. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 1. Unit 2 is right here. If you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then click right here in the card. And I'll see you next time.